The fins on this model are probably the most detailed and time-consuming parts, because there are actually a whole bunch of detail pieces here that we have to put together. So here are the main fins themselves. Alright, and then the detail pieces here. These were originally wrapped up in the brown paper bag. Okay, so we have these guys here that will form the reinforcements for the root edges of the fins. So there should be a total of 8 of those. Okay, and then these are the F pieces here. Alright, and these are going to be forward of the fins. And then these are the C pieces. These are going to go along the sides and go into the raised area here of the tail piece. So first of all, these are all going to need their surfaces sanded. Now for these guys here, wait on doing that until we attach them to the fins. These are really thin and really easily broken. Now the instructions refer us to a tapering guide here. Okay. So the first one here are these F pieces, and actually this has already been done for us. So we don't need to taper them. They're already tapered. Alright, now for the main fins here, okay, so these are going to go along this way. And what I'm going to do is make some measurements and transfer them over. Okay, but this is actually a taper. So this is going to be sanded down into a knife edge type taper here all along the leading edge of the fin. And then the trailing edge as well. Alright, there will be a taper that goes across that part of the fin. So the first thing we want to do is simply sand the surfaces of the 4 main fins, just to smooth those out a little bit. Okay, and then I am going to recommend using sanding sealer on this, and especially the polyurethane type. Now I know some people don't like them because they kind of clog things up, but with these really thin, wide tapers on here, that's going to be a really fragile surface, and I think the polyurethane based sanding sealer is going to help strengthen those. So I'm going to start this out by simply sanding the faces. And here I've got 100 grit sandpaper on a sanding tee. I'm just going to sand with the grain here. Okay, so just like that. And then here I have the surfaces of my fins sanded, and I just gave them a light sanding to take off any rough spots there. And note that the fins are not identical. So one pair of the main fins has this larger notch in it, while as the other pair has a smaller notch back at the aft end of the fin. And the difference here is to mate properly with the engine mount that has more of a bulge on one side than the other. So do take note of this. When we go to put the trim pieces on, the fin support trim pieces are also matched to those notches. So our next job is to taper the fins. Alright, so we're going to come back here to our tapering guide. And this you use the same guide for all the fins. And so what I'm going to do here, if you just put this overlaid, Alright, so things match up properly. Alright, and I'm going to make there's a pencil mark right here. Alright, and I'm going to make another pencil mark right there. Okay, and then over here, right about there. And then over on that edge, okay, right about there. And you'll do this on both sides. So the first thing I'm going to do is just now lightly pencil in lines between those two sets of marks. Okay, like that. And what we'll do then is we're going to sand these so that the leading edge here will sand down halfway in the middle. So this is going to have a knife edge on it coming from both directions. Alright, the trailing edge will also have that going this direction. Alright, so this back edge here is also going to have a knife edge and come to meet in the middle of it. Alright, for the other side of the fin we do the same thing. So just put it on the other template here. Alright, and once more we're going to go from that corner down to about here. From here over to here. And once more I'm going to go ahead and draw those lines in. Basically the lines are the stopping point for the taper. Okay. So we'll need to do this to the other three fins. I'm going to do that off camera, and when we come back then I will start sanding the taper into them. Here I have all of my fins marked for the tapers, and this next step is going to generate a lot of dust. So you may want to consider doing this either in a well-ventilated area indoors or even taking it outside to do the sanding. So here I'm going to use a sanding tee. If you don't have one, I would recommend at least a sanding block to do this so you get nice flat edges here. And I'm going to start by just knocking down the corner edges on both sides. And that's going to start my taper. Now be careful on the back sides here. So on the aft edges of the fins, you're going to be doing a lot of sanding potentially across the grain here. Okay. And it just means the wood is weaker in this direction, so just be careful of that. Alright, but basically I'm following my lines here. Okay, so I'm holding it at an angle, but my direction here is going in the same direction as my taper lines. And the idea here on the aft end is I'm trying to taper this whole thing at once, not each tab there on either side of that notch. Okay, and then we can come back here and do the edges once more. Okay, and the idea here is don't go too far on any one side or any edge at the same time, because we need to have all this brought down equally so that when the tapers meet in the middle, they are symmetrical and uniform. Okay, so I am frequently going to come back here, and I'm watching this flat line slowly disappear. Now notice I'm getting a lot more here in the middle than I am on the edges, so I need to come back and do a little bit more work there. Okay, now there's something to watch for. As this taper gets closer and closer to being a knife edge, that very leading tip there is going to become very fragile, so just be careful of that. Okay, so I've almost got my full taper here. I'm just kind of looking to see if there's one side that needs more. Looks like this side needs some more sanding. Bring it back toward the line a little bit. Okay, so by about the time you've got this all sanded, you're going to have a nice knife edge here along the leading edge, and you should have sanded right up to your line, maybe even erasing at least part of your line there. Okay, now just for the purposes of strength, I'm going to leave just a little bit of a flat edge here. So I haven't quite completely erased that flat edge, and I'm going to do that just so I don't have this really thin knife edge that's going to become really brittle and easy to break. Okay, now to come back to my trailing edge here, same general principle, as we want to do a little bit on each side at a time and work our way back toward those lines. And as we did before, so you can see here where I'm putting more pressure back on here than I am here, so I need to balance that out. And part of that's also caused because this is not a parallel line to the fin edge, so things are going to be a little bit different. And I've gone a little bit far there. It's not going to make a big difference. But again, this is a problem you're going to run into having this line the way it is you tend to overdo this edge here and not enough here. Alright, check my cross sections again. Alright, knife edge there is pretty good. Try and even things out. So there I've got a fine knife edge. It's actually a little bit more than I wanted. I wanted to kind of stop the same way I did on the other side. And that's okay. Okay, so I've been sanding with 150 grit sandpaper. Okay, and at this point you really don't need to go any finer, because ultimately we're going to then add some balsa supports that go down along the root edge, and after we put those on, we're going to sanding seal the whole thing. Now if you're not going to use sanding sealer, then by all means go ahead and sand this a bit more, although you may still want to wait until after we glue on the reinforcing supports that will go along the leading edge there. So that's something we come to in a little while when we have all the fins sanded. Okay, so I'm going to do the other 3 fins off camera, because it'd be really boring to watch 4 fins being sanded on video. I have my fins tapered, and now we need to glue on these fin supports to each fin. Now note again here that we've got actually 2 types of fins here. So one of these sets of fins has a long notch here at the base. The other set has a tall set at the base here. So we've got these little notches here, and the supports here are cut to match those. Okay, so some of the supports have a long short notch, and some have a tall notch here. Okay, and so these are going to go on like this. Alright, and it's okay here, so like this has got just a little bit more wood to it. Alright, so I'm going to line the notch there, and since I've already tapered this, we're actually going to try and glue this along the taper. And then when we're all done, if there's a little bit of excess wood there, we can shave that off. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do one of these, what are called the A fins here, as an example, and then I'm going to do the other ones off camera. Now for this step, I'm going to want a little bit more working time than my wood glue gives me. Now there are longer working time wood glues out there as well, but I'm just going to use good old-fashioned Elmer's white glue. And here the best applicator is your finger. Okay, so making sure I've got everything lined up and I have the right face there. Here I'm just going to make a very thin but uniform layer of glue. Okay, we don't want glue bulging out, and we don't want it running all over the place. But since the Elmer's dries a little bit more slowly, if we have to reposition this or otherwise move it around, we'll be able to do so with a little bit of leeway, at least a couple of minutes. Okay, so try and get this as even as you can here without any pooling. Okay, so I'm going to start this at that notch. Okay, so the base of the reinforcement needs to be flush with the root edge of the fin, and also flush with the back edge there. And I'm just going to run this forward, holding it down. Alright, and also here on the front edge, we want this to follow the taper as much as we can. Alright, now you can hold this on using some small paper clips or even some small spring clamps if you have those. Alright, that was trying to move away from the root edge there, so pop that back out and reposition here. Now in here, there's going to be some extensions that fit into this. It's going to make a little socket, so don't worry about that part too much. Okay, and also because there's going to be something in this socket here, if this piece here does not remain glued, that's okay. We will fix that later. Now you can see here that this is trying to bow up. So I'm going to go ahead and put some paper clips on here, at least for the moment. Alright, I'm going to try and follow the tapers as well. Okay, we can put another one up here. Alright, and even down along the main part of it here. This is being particularly sensitive to the moisture. Okay, and again, if you got little spring clamps, those will work great too. And once I get both sides of these on, I will probably do that. Okay, so for now I'm going to go ahead and let this finish gluing the way it is. And then I'm going to flip it over and put the other one on. And once I've got the second one on, I can press the whole thing under a book or something like that. Okay, but just keep in mind this is going to take a little while to do, so be patient, have other things that you can do in between gluing, and when we come back I will have this one completed with its other side, and I'll do the other fins off camera as well. While I'm waiting for the fin assemblies to dry, there's one other part that we need to taper here. These are the F parts, and these will fit into the channels in the front portions of the fins that is formed by gluing on the fin supports to the fins themselves. So it leaves a channel in front. If you look down on these, they're tapered on both sides, and what we need to do now is taper from this little line here right at the base of the triangle down to the surface. Okay, so that when this is finished, it's going to be tapered on 3 sides. And then the fourth side will be the base that will be glued onto the body tube. So to do this, we can just take a piece of 100 to 150 grit sandpaper and just start by holding it at a bit of an angle here. Make a few strokes across the sandpaper. Okay, and then compare that to where we want it to go. So that's a little bit too steep yet. This is going to be a really shallow angle. So we'll give it a few more strokes there. And that looks about right. So if I hold that angle, by the time it gets down to the tip, it should be pretty close to back to that little etching mark. Okay, so there I've got it just not quite back. I can do just a little bit more. You can see here that that's tapering nicely. I'm trying to leave just a little bit of material here right at the tip so that it doesn't come to a complete knife edge, and that's just for strength. If you have that completely sharp in there, it's going to be really easy for it to get blunted over. Okay, but that's how it should look there. And I'm going to do this to the other 3 off camera. Now we also need to sand the undersides of these 2 pieces here. These are the G pieces, and they will go up against the red projections here on the engine mount. And so if you just put these up against here, we've got these gaps between the rounded body tube and the flat balsa. And also we want the top surface of the balsa here to be flush with the red surface. We're going to need to sand a concave surface onto these projections here. And to do this, we're going to use this extra body tube that was included with the kit that has the X on the tube. So it's not actually part of the build, it's just here to give us a rounded surface that's going to be the same as the surface of the body tube itself. Okay, so here I'm going to take this piece and I'm just going to sand it back and forth, trying to keep it as uniform as possible here, and just keep sanding this until I get the inner surface concave and the outer surface flush with the motor mount. The biggest problem I run into here is as I'm getting this sanded down, I'm also inadvertently sanding the sides of my fingers a bit. So if you have small skinny fingers, this will be an easier task. There we go. Okay. So that fits, yeah, that actually feels pretty flush there. So we'll glue this on later, and if you need to, you can kind of fine tune the shape right here with an emery board or a small file. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing to my other G part here, but I'm going to do this off camera because this is boring enough to watch. Here I have both of my pieces sanded here. You can see they're curved in cross section. And I'm going to put sanding sealer on these, and I have sanded the top surfaces with fine grit sandpaper as well. But I will put some sanding sealer on these before we actually go to glue them on, but only on the outer surfaces, not on this convex surface here, or concave, excuse me. Okay, also the glue is dried on my fin assemblies now. Okay, now you can see here, because we tapered this, the glue does not want to hold on there, and so I intentionally left this open. When I put the rest of this together, I just set a heavy object on top of here as just a big book to put this together, but you'll notice here that the tapers have a little bit of a gap in them. Now, I intentionally did not go in to do those quite yet, because first of all we need to make sure that this piece, the F pieces here, are going to be able to fit in the little socket that this makes. Okay, so that's going to go in like that, and with that in place we actually don't need these to come down to the tip. In fact, you don't want them to come down to the tip, because otherwise this will not fit properly. And what I am planning to do then is, once this is all glued together on the rocket, then I can come in and take some glue and just put it right into those areas that still need them, and put a little micro spring clamp on that to hold it in place. Okay, so when this is all done, it's going to look about like this. Actually, it's going to look like that. Now we're also going to sand the root edges of the completed fin assembly here on our sanding tube so that this surface will conform better to the tube as well. However, I'm going to use some sanding sealer on this first so that it adds a little bit of strength to the side pieces here before we start sanding on them. So for the sanding sealer, I'm using a polyurethane based one, and the hope with this is that the polyurethane will actually add some strength to the thin balsa that's used for trim on this. And I'm just applying it with a long cotton applicator here. You can use a paintbrush if you like. So this takes a couple hours to dry, and so I like to do pretty much all that I can at once. So I'm going to do all of the fins and then all of the trim pieces as well. And then it's best to, after this dries, to go ahead and sand it and then apply another coat and sand that. And you can repeat that as many times as you want, although I found usually 2 to 3 coats is enough, especially if you're going to follow this with a good filling primer. Okay, try not to get it on the root edge, although if you do, it'll sand out. It just takes longer and clogs up your sandpaper more. And I'm going to hit the leading edges here really well, and my tip edge. Okay, so now I'm going to let this dry, and I'm going to repeat the whole process for the other 3 fins, the little extension pieces here, as well as the pieces that we just sanded for attachment to the tube. The first coat of sanding sealer has dried on all of my fins and fin parts. So now I'm going to use some 220 grit sandpaper here and just lightly sand off the excess sanding sealer. And basically what we're trying to do is knock down the high spots, and that will leave the low spots more filled. And then after a second coat, it will fill in those lower spots even more. And the number of coatings you want to use is really up to personal preference. Some people like to get this as smooth as plastic or fiberglass. As long as I get most of the grain filled in, I'm usually happy with it, and then the remaining grain can be filled in with primer. Okay, now be particularly careful at the edges here where we have not yet fully tacked down the reinforcements here. We don't want to catch those and break them off. Okay. And remember, these are tapered, so you need to sand with the tapers on those so that all of the wood gets a sanding. Now you may have some difficulty getting into these little notches here. Probably you can just kind of get in there with a corner like I'm doing here. You could also use a small emery board or even a small sanding rod in there. But it's not that big a deal. A little more here. Okay, so the rest of this I'm going to do off camera, but I do want to discuss some of the finishing options here. So in the instructions, they actually recommend pre-painting the fins before gluing them on. And this is because it is a fairly complex paint scheme. And if you take a look at the box once more here, okay, all of the fin parts here are black. And so it's going to be a lot easier to pre-paint those rather than trying to mask them all there. And I am going to do that as well. So what we'll need to do is I'm going to put on a second coat of sanding sealer, sand it down as well, and do that with all of the other fins and fin parts. Okay, and then we're going to paint these first with primer and then with black paint. And then the next thing we'll do when that part is all done is we'll come back to our spare tube here, and putting sandpaper on there again, we're going to sand this surface here because with the reinforcements and the fin themselves being pretty thick, it's not going to make a nice joint unless we round the insides of this. Okay, so I'm going to go off camera now and finish my sanding and sealing. And here I've finished the sanding sealer and the final gluing of the fins here. And I use these little spring clamps to do the very edges here at the trailing edge, where the reinforcements here have to come at a little bit of a rounded angle here to glue onto the fins themselves. And I'm just going to take a little emery board here and use that to file off any excess glue. Okay, and this just gives me a little bit of finer control for shaping this here. Alright, now you may be able to see here there's kind of a little bit of a gouge there. I don't think I caused that. I think it was just a defect in the wood. This has been sanded and sealed once, and it looks like it's going to need at least another coat of the sanding sealer here. Alright, but once that gets done, I'm planning to prime these and then paint them before putting them onto the rocket. And that'll be coming up. Now, of course, if you're watching this video, you're seeing all this being time compressed into about an hour. But these fins have been taking quite a long time to do all the fine detail work here, and also to get them filled without sanding off the detail features here as well. Here I have all of my fin pieces primed, And for the little guys here, this is probably going to be enough. Alright, I'm just going to sand these down with a little bit of 320 grit sandpaper. Alright, so the little pieces probably won't need another coat. That one might, but we'll see how it comes out. Now if we look at the fins themselves, you can still see some wood grain in here. And depending on how you treated the wood, I only used 2 coats of sanding sealer. You could use another coat or 2 to help reduce this. But this primer is supposed to be a filling primer, so the other thing you can do with this is give it a light sanding, put another primer coat on there, sand that down until all of the grain is gone, if that's what you desire. Right? If you're more interested in just getting this put together and flying it, then if you don't mind a little wood grain, we'll just sand this off and then paint it. Okay, now again, if you're going to paint this before putting it all together, you'll also need to consider what you want to do with the body tube here, because it's really hard to put glue to stick to paint really well. And so if you pre-paint this white, like it shows on the cover, then you'll either have to sand or scrape down the paint to get back down to where the fins are going to go. Or what I'm going to do is, once I make my marks for where the fins are going to go, I'm going to mask those areas off and then prime and paint the whole rocket, and then peel that back when I need to go and put the fins and fin parts on. Here I have all my fins and trim pieces painted flat black, and you may notice there's still some wood grain in there, and that's because I've just kind of gotten in a hurry trying to finish this video. But from a distance you really can't notice it. But this is after 2 coats of sanding sealer. Okay, and again, you could use additional coats and sand those again, but I'm going to go ahead and go with this. For the next part, you're going to need the extra body tube once more here. I'm going to remove this masking tape. Okay, and again, we're just going to use this as a mold, essentially, for our sanding paper. And then on our fins, we want to pull this down along that and try and keep that fin as perpendicular to the tube as you can. Okay. And the idea here is to sand in a curvature that's going to be the same as the body tube. So that when we actually do mount the fins, we won't have a big gap there at the base of the fin. Okay, so it doesn't take much. That fin is almost done. So we'll just give it a few more strokes here. You might want to use longer sandpaper than I've got here, so you can just do the whole thing at once. And it has less chance of slipping around there. This will also even out any minor inconsistencies in the thickness of our reinforcements here. So if you had one that kind of creeped over the edge a little bit, or was just beyond the edge a little bit, that should take care of those irregularities. Okay, so now just line this up. Take a look at it. If the fin is perpendicular, do we have any gaps? Still have just a little bit there, but not too much. Okay. Alright, that looks pretty good. I'm going to do the same thing with the rest of the fins off camera. And then the other thing I'm going to do is take my joined body tube here, and I'm going to prime this and then give it a coat or 2 of flat white spray paint. I thought about masking this off to begin with. In the instructions they recommend simply scraping off the paint in the area where the fins and other parts are going to be glued on. And I think in the long run that'll actually be easier. While I'm waiting for the glue to dry on the body tube, we can come back to the nose cone here. Now recall I delayed doing this part until we could put the canards on, and so let's do that first. And this also reminded me there are two little tiny bits of wood in here. Those are going to go on the aft edge of two of the fins, and they will need to be painted black as well, and I will do that off camera here. So those are the two pieces of wood I'm talking of, so just go ahead and take those out when you got a chance and paint them black. Okay, so the canards are going to go in to the holes here. And so before we do anything permanent, let's go ahead and make sure they all fit. Okay, that one's actually a little bit loose. Let's see if I've got a tighter one I can stick there. Alright, so I just need to be aware of that one when I go to glue things on. Right, otherwise, those all fit nicely. Okay, and we're gluing two dissimilar plastics here, so a gel type super glue or even epoxy are going to be probably the best choices here. Now before I put that on, we also want to take a look at the nose cone itself. This nose cone has two seams on it here from the molding process, and you can just leave these alone. I like to sand this, and not only will help knock down that seam, but it'll make the nose cone easier to paint. And so just start with a bit of medium grit sandpaper. This is 150, I believe. So first I'm just going to sand that seam and knock down the high points on it. Actually, I think that's 100 grit. That's okay. I'm going to then make a finer sanding here. Here's some 150. That will help smooth that out. Okay, and I'm going to use the 150 to go all the way around the nose cone. And what this does is it breaks up the smooth finish of the molded plastic, and this will allow the paint to adhere better. Okay, and then let's move to some 220 grit here. Okay, so just doing that by itself has hidden most of the seam. Now if you really want to completely smooth in that seam, I recommend using some plastic model contour putty. This one's made by Testors. There are several brands out there. But I think on my rocket I think it's going to be good enough that I don't need to do that. Okay, so I'm just going to do a little more sanding here. Now I'm going to wipe that down with just a little bit of rubbing alcohol, just to remove any dust and flakes and such. You can just use water for this. I use alcohol simply because it evaporates quicker. Okay. Now you can also use some even finer grained sandpaper. You can use 320 or even 400 on here. But I found that with the 220, once it's been primed and painted, it's sufficient. Now make sure whatever you use to clean this has fully evaporated. And then we can go ahead and put the fins on. I'm going to use some gel type super glue for this. And we want to get a good contact, but we don't want this stuff oozing out all over the place either. Like that. Alright, so just a bead along there. That's still way too much. It's not the best applicator, apparently. Alright, and then we're simply going to place that into the hole there, and then make sure it's straight. If you have a fin alignment tool that will fit over this nose cone, that would be a good way to help maintain the straightness of the fins. Yeah, I'm not too happy with these applicators. If you have a choice, get one that's got a finer point applicator. Okay, now this was the one that was really loose, so I'm going to let it sit by itself for just a few minutes to make sure that glue dries. Okay, and when I come back I'll have the other two done. My canard fins are all glued in place, and so now we can come back to what was actually one of the first steps in the instructions and add the plasticine clay. And do make sure that you add all of this, or if you use something else for the weight, make sure that it weighs at least as much as the clay does here. And so now what we're going to do is simply start making little clay balls and clay worms here, whichever you prefer. Alright, and then slide those in. And you'll want to make sure that you've got a dowel or a long pencil handy, and we'll use that to pack this all together. Oop, go back there. Okay, so now I've got it all packed in there, and you can turn it, I don't know if you can see this in the video, but you can see kind of a translucency here, and it'll tell you where the clay is. So it looks like I need to put down a little bit more squishing here along one side. If you're thinking about alternatives to this, although I don't know why you would, the clay works nicely. But one way is to pour epoxy resin into this. Again, making sure you have the same weight as the clay. Some people also use lead or steel shot and then cover it with epoxy. That works well too. But it comes with the clay, so why go to the expense of getting something else? Alright, so that's all packed in there, and this now can go on to be primed as well.